Thank you everyone for coming to the final lecture this term for the Archaeological Field Club's Lent Term Seminar Series. Today we will be hearing from Professor Jeremy DeSilva on our first steps, how walking upright made us human. Professor DeSilva is a professor of anthropology as well as the chair of the Department of Anthropology at Dartmouth College. And he's also an honorary research fellow at the University of Witwatersrand in their Evolutionary Studies Institute. His work primarily focuses on the evolution of various models of locomotion exhibited in hominoids and early hominins. He has studied a wide array of fossil hominin specimens, studied Western chimpanzees, and has been part of the teams which discovered and described the species of Australopithecus sediba and Homo naledi. He was also an editor for A Most Interesting Problem, What Darwin's Descent of Man Got Right and Wrong About Human Evolution. And most relevant for today is the author of First Steps, How Walking Upright Made Us Human. And with that, let's please welcome Professor Jeremy DeSilva.
Well, thank you all very much. I'm going to share my screen. Are you seeing my slide? And is it a title slide with no notes?
Yeah.
Awesome. That's good. Okay. Wow. The technology worked the first time. Thanks, Liam and Emily for the invitation to be here. I'm really excited to share a little bit about my book. So the first half of the talk will be just hitting some of the highlights of what's in a book that came out last year on the evolution of upright walking, which is what I study. And then for the second half of the talk, I'm going to take you to Tanzania, and we're going to go to the site of Laetoli, where I've been working the last couple of summers, sort of before pandemic, after pandemic, and share with you some pretty fun new discoveries that we've made at that site that I think are, if we're interpreting them right, complicating the story of the evolution of bipedalism or upright walking in some really fun ways. So look, let's face it, humans are really, really weird. Although we are mammals, we have very little body hair. We have exceptionally large brains for our body size, and we've developed complex cultures. While other animals communicate, we talk. Most animals can pant to dissipate body heat, but we sweat. And I would say perhaps oddest of all, humans navigate the world on 2 rather than 4 legs. We are bipedal. So in today's talk, I'm going to cover some of the material that's in my new book, First Steps, which examines the evolutionary history of bipedal walking and explores how this form of locomotion was the gateway for many of the changes that made us human. And then we'll talk about the Laetoli footprints next. So as most of you, I'm sure know, DNA studies and comparative anatomy, comparative behavior indicate that humans are most closely related to the African great apes, and in particular to chimpanzees and to bonobos. Of course, that doesn't mean that we came from them any more than they came from us. These are our cousins. And our lineage and theirs diverged from a common ancestor, which lived about 6 to 7 million years ago. And it's fun to think about how long ago that was. So if you assume that a new generation appears every 25 years or so, the last common ancestor that I shared with this chimpanzee was my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother. And you'd have about 240 to 250,000 greats in front of grandmother. In other words, if I said great once a second, it would take me 3 full days without a break to reach that point where my lineage diverged from a chimpanzee's. So that time depth is really important, I think, to sort of think about as we're dealing with the evolution of our own lineage. Now, if this is the case, of course, if humans share a common ancestor with chimpanzees, then we should find fossils of things that were neither human nor chimpanzee, but shared some characteristics of both. And we'd find them presumably and predominantly in Africa in sediments going back 6 to 7 million years. Now, a lot of folks call these missing links, and it's a term I'm not particularly fond of because they're not really missing. We literally have thousands of fossils of ancient human ancestors and extinct relatives. Granted, many of these are isolated teeth and toe bones, an elbow here, proximal femur there. But we also have some really complete fossils, partial skeletons, that help us piece together the story of human evolution. Of course, we call these hominins, and shown here on this slide are some of the most famous. You could think of them as kind of the greatest hits of our science. Now, every fossil we have, whether it is a partial skeleton like Lucy or Carabo or Neriocotome, or if it's a fragment, even if it's a tiny little fragment of a tibia or a toe bone, every one of these fossils tells us an important story about us. So these bones are all that remain of breathing, thinking beings who laughed and cried, lived and eventually died. And they help us piece together this story of how we became human. Now, the general framework of human evolution is pretty well established, but it's complicated, and new fossils are constantly forcing us to reassess our old ideas. That's fine. That's how science works. Now, at the very beginning of the story, though, if we could go back 6-7 million years ago, long before evidence for stone tools, before controlled fire, before brains enlarged, before language and art, our ancestors evolved the ability to walk on just their two legs. What got us started on this remarkable human journey was the way we move. Now, how do we know this? We know this because the very oldest fossils in the human lineage, recovered from ancient sediments in Africa, in Chad, Kenya, Ethiopia, they preserve anatomies that are consistent with moving on two legs. Now, we'll come back to the fossils in a second, but for now, just understand the main point that I'm trying to make is that walking on two legs is old. It's an ancient defining characteristic of our lineage. But from an evolutionary perspective, it's also really, really odd. There are mammals out there that fly, swim, cling, and leap. There are mammals that swing, sprint, knuckle walk, and climb. And there are also mammals that hop, right? And those are bipeds as well. But what I'm focused on are the ones that stride one leg at a time. And then most mammals do what the cow in the bottom right does. It just moves around on all fours. And you see this in goats and sheep, horses, dogs, cats, squirrels, you name it. That's the traditional way to move if you're a mammal, but not us. We move on our extended hind limbs, and that's a really strange way for a mammal to get around. Now, here's how strange. In a typical lifetime, the average non-disabled person takes about 150 million steps. That's enough to circle the Earth 3 times, but we don't think much about it at all. If I posted a video of myself walking, I would imagine most of you wouldn't care, and you wouldn't find it interesting enough to watch. But watch this. This is a YouTube video of a bipedal bear who is named Petals, moving on 2 legs through a New Jersey suburb. It's been viewed over 7 million times. And this particular bear was featured on the CBS Morning News. It made national and I believe international news. When humans walk, we have a word for it, right? It's pedestrian, it's ordinary. But when another mammal moves on 2 legs, it makes the news. Bipedalism has made its way into our words, our expressions, and our entertainment. You think about the many, many ways that we describe walking. We stroll, stride, plod, traipse, amble, saunter, shuffle, tiptoe. We lumber, tromp, lope, strut, and we swagger. After walking all over somebody, we might be asked to walk a mile in their shoes. Heroes walk on water, while geniuses are walking encyclopedias. To humanize an animated character like Winnie the Pooh or Brian the dog from Family Guy, they're drawn as bipeds. And think of the joy we experience watching a child's first steps. The Dutch master Vincent van Gogh captured such a scene in 1889. And a quarter of a century later, my own kid, who's now 12, I love this video though, my own kid took their first steps. Benjamin, taking their first steps. Now, once kids start walking, they don't stop. I visited Karen Adolph's developmental psychology lab at NYU, and she's just a brilliant scholar and really thinks about how kids learn how to do all sorts of things, including walking. And there, she recorded a toddler following this path in blue, this convoluted path. And this took 10 minutes for this kid to make this path. On average, a toddler will take 2,368 steps. This is the length of 8 American football fields every hour. And that's how kids learn to walk. As Karen Adolph has written, they take thousands of steps and make dozens of falls per day. Now, walking on two legs, bipedalism, is more than just getting from point A to point B. It is a form of communication and identification. My wife and I both work at Dartmouth College here in New Hampshire, and I occasionally spot her striding across the campus green. I've changed my usual picture of the Dartmouth green and all of its green to this white image. We're getting a lot of snow these days. We're getting another meter, half a meter of snow. In fact, starting tonight into Wednesday. Now I know how she moves just from, I know it's her just from her walk. Even when I'm too far away to see her face, I can tell it's her. And from her cadence and from her posture, I can tell if she's in a good mood or if she's had a tough day. Now, each of us has our own unique gait, and humans are particularly fine-tuned to identify individuals from their walk. Now, why? One of the things I speculate is that gait and posture cues might have been a critical means of communication in our pre-verbal ancestors, especially when there were multiple hominin species coexisting on the same landscape. I'll get to that in the second half of the talk. Now, not only that, but there are physical and mental benefits to walking. A 2012 study done by the National Cancer Institute on 650,000 people found that individuals who did the exercise equivalent of a 25-minute daily walk lived on average 4 years longer than their sedentary counterparts. 4 years. A daily walk has been shown to improve memory and creativity. It helps ward off certain cancers, diabetes, stroke, and cardiovascular disease. But of course, this isn't magic. The physiological mechanism is being figured out, starting with work done by Danish physiologist Bente Klarlund Petersen. She and her team discovered that your muscles act as endocrine organs, and they release molecules called myokines into the bloodstream when they contract. These myokines target organs throughout the body, helping maintain health. Now, it's not that walking is some cure-all, though. As somebody who studies human evolution, I see this somewhat differently. Walking is our default. It's what we do. It's what we've always done. Throughout our history, if we wanted to eat, we had to walk. What's new is not walking. And that immobility has had a huge impact on our collective health. Now, I do want to take a moment to recognize that this can be really complicated. Having the opportunity to take a walk safely and without harassment or worse is a privilege that's not afforded to everyone as long as racism and sexism persist in our society. But taking a walk and the biological ability to do so is really important, and it's always been. Upright walking set into motion all of the major evolutionary events in the human lineage, from dietary changes, the diversification of our diet, freeing the hands to create and use tools, to cooperative parenting, brain enlargement, language, and the development of trade networks, eventually allowing us, a once humble ape standing in the ancient Miocene forests, to populate the globe. Despite this, though, and one of the things that keeps me motivated as a researcher is that we still aren't sure why upright walking evolved at all. There are hypotheses about bipedalism evolving to carry food or to carry babies. Some researchers have posited that upright walking was energetically beneficial to our ancestors, and that's why it evolved. There are ideas that uprightness helped our ancestors see over tall grass, pick low-hanging fruit, or even wade through water. Now, of course, there's the ever-present, but I think incorrect idea that ancient hominins stood on two legs to wield weapons. We have very little evidence for this at all. This is the so-called killer ape idea made famous in Stanley Kubrick's science fiction thriller 2001, A Space Odyssey. And it is very, very much still part of popular culture and people's ideas out there. Now, I'm also sure that you are familiar with this image. If you Google image human evolution, this is the kind of thing that pops up, or you get things like this, or even that. This sequence, which is called the March of Progress, appears on t-shirts and coffee cups and bumper stickers. It's kind of an iconic image of our science. But it always assumes that the earliest upright walking hominins were hunched over, having evolved from a chimpanzee-like knuckle walking ancestor. And what I want to propose is that this might not be right either. In fact, We still aren't sure the body form from which upright walking first evolved. There are some researchers who have proposed that instead of bipedalism evolving from the ground up from a knuckle walker, it happened from the top down, from an ape standing or swinging in the trees. Now, to test these ideas, we really need fossils, ideally partial skeletons from 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 million years ago. Those, however, are, for the most part, yet to be discovered. What we have instead are fragments. We have tantalizing fragments, a skull here, a femur there, toe bone. But in paleoanthropology, in the science we do, you work with what you have. So what do we have? Well, the most relevant partial skeletons to address this particular question have been announced to the world in just the last decade or so. And they're Ardipithecus ramidus, it's a 4.5 million year old hominin from Ethiopia, nicknamed Ardi, first published in 2009. And Udo, this is from a species called Danuvius guggenmosi, which was discovered in 2019 by paleontologist Madeline Burma. Udo was found in Germany and is about 11.5 million years old. And you heard that right, it's in Germany. 11.5 million years ago, there were vast forests around what is today the Mediterranean, and ancient apes once lived in southern Europe. We find their fossils in Spain, France, Italy, Greece, Turkey, Hungary, and in this case, Germany. So even though we don't have the skeletons yet from the exact time period of the last common ancestor, we have some fossils, but not partial skeletons, 6, 7 million years old. We do have these two skeletons from 4.5 million and 11.5 million years ago. So in other words, we have the bookends to the story, but not the story itself. And I know we eventually will, and I hope to see that someday. Every year we find more and more fossils. But for now, the question we can ask is, can we still learn something about our common ancestor from these bookends? And I think we can. These skeletons suggest to me that, and to many others, but not everyone, that the common ancestor of humans and African apes may not have been a knuckle walker at all, but an ape moving in the trees on two legs, something orangutans, gibbons, and even spider monkeys will sometimes do, hand-assisted bipedal walking. If that turns out to be the case, then we no longer have to come up with an explanation for why bipedalism evolved from a knuckle walker, because it didn't. It wasn't a new locomotion at all, just an old locomotion in a new setting. As my colleague Carol Ward has said, asking why humans stood up from all fours is the wrong question. Perhaps we should instead be asking why our ancestors never dropped down on all fours in the first place. Now, look, it would be foolish for me to think we have this all figured out. Next year, a team could announce the discovery of a knuckle-walking ancestor, 8 million year old African ape fossil, and that would, of course, force us to reevaluate and reassess all of this. And that's fine. That's how science, again, works. There is a lot out there waiting to be discovered, more fossils yet to be found, and a whole lot of the human story yet to be written. But one of the things I still wonder about is why we're here at all, why bipedalism was beneficial. We humans are pathetically slow animals. Even the fastest human to have ever lived, Usain Bolt, here he is, he maxed out at 28 miles an hour during his world record-setting 100-meter dash in 2009. 28 miles per hour. That's half the speed of a typical galloping quadruped of our size. He couldn't catch an antelope or flee from a lion. In fact, 2 leopard fang holes that are positioned in the back of the head of an ancient human fossil discovered in a South African cave are a gruesome reminder that there were evolutionary consequences for our lack of speed. Furthermore, the short, squat pelvis that biomechanically adapts humans for efficient bipedal travel forces a baby to corkscrew through the birth canal during delivery, making childbirth difficult and sometimes even dangerous. We are unstable on our 2 legs. We fall a lot. When's the last time you saw a squirrel, cow, cat, or dog just trip and fall? Now, I'm making light of this, but there are 30,000 Americans and 500,000 people worldwide who die from falls each year. And as we age, and I am really feeling it these days, bipedalism takes its painful toll on our backs, knees, and feet. Bipedalism not only leaves us vulnerable to leg and foot injuries, but it makes us particularly feeble when they happen. Now, obviously, the advantage of bipedal locomotion, or the advantages, outweigh the costs. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. We would have gone extinct long ago. But given the many downsides to upright walking and how rare this form of locomotion is in the animal, particularly mammalian world, I've wondered what tipped the scales towards survival rather than extinction. And one of the answers that I'll propose today might be found with one of the more, or I would say even the most wonderful and mysterious aspects of being human. It's rumored that an anthropology student once asked the famous anthropologist Margaret Mead what the earliest evidence of human civilization was. And after a brief reflection, Margaret Mead responded, "A healed femur." Now, this exchange, it turns out, is likely apocryphal, but I think the point is a good one. The point remains. So I wonder then what Professor Mead would have thought of this fossil. It's a fossil from the eastern side of Lake Turkana, the Kubifora region. It's about 2 million years old. And this is a femur with a healed fracture, most likely a stress fracture in the shaft of the femur, a healed one. Or this fossil. This is another 2 million year old fossil from Kenya, from the same region. And this is a shin bone that preserves evidence for an ankle fracture. But again, it's a healed one. Or this fossil. This is an even older 3.5 million year old partial skeleton discovered in Ethiopia by Johannes Haile Selassie. It's from Lucy species. It's a large male, many think. And he too broke his ankle as a child, but he didn't die from that. It healed and he lived into adulthood. So I want you to think about this for a second. Long before hospitals and doctors, long before fire and shelter, our already slow and unstable ancestors living on a dangerous landscape littered with large carnivores that want to eat them, these hominins were occasionally breaking their bones and surviving? To me, this only means one thing. They were helping each other out. They were assisting one another. We have had each other's backs for a long, long time. Bombarded in our 24-hour news cycle with examples of human cruelty, we often overlook how remarkably cooperative and tolerant humans can be. Helping one another comes naturally to us, whether it's holding a door for a neighbor, donating spare change, passing a plate to share food with others. These are such everyday occurrences that human kindness, kind of like walking, has become pedestrian. It could be then that one of the most mysterious aspects of the human condition, our capacity for selflessness, arose out of our vulnerabilities as bipeds in a dangerous world. These behavioral changes that accompanied the evolution of walking are not just important for those who can walk, but also for those who cannot. As descendants of bipedal hominins, our evolutionary journey continues because empathy, cooperation, and generosity evolved, I think, in lockstep with our distinctive form of locomotion. After millions of years and dozens of evolutionary experiments, we humans, the last bipedal ape on Earth, as we stride forward as a species into uncertain and pretty unsettling times, I do think it helps to glance back over our shoulder at the trail that we've left. We've traveled very far and overcome much, and we've done this together. Now, this trail that I've put up here is from the site of Laetoli in Tanzania, footprints that are 3.5 million years old, and convincing evidence and unchallenged evidence that our ancestors were moving bipedally at this time in our evolutionary history. The site of Laetoli, where I'm going to shift to next, is in northern Tanzania, wedged between the Serengeti to the west and Ngorongoro Crater to the east. And it's just south of Olduvai Gorge, where Mary Leakey and Louis Leakey had been working for several decades. After Louis's death, Mary and a team came to Laetoli and started finding fossils. But it wasn't until 1976 that they discovered the first footprints. And the first footprints were discovered by accident. This is one of the great serendipitous discoveries in the history of our science. On July 25th, 1976, a team was visiting the site of Laetoli, and they started throwing elephant dung at each other. They got into an elephant dung dodgeball fight. Andrew Hill and Kay Berensmeyer didn't want to get hit. Who does with elephant dung? And so they jumped down into a gully that had been water eroded, and it had exposed this layer of hardened volcanic ash that preserved fossilized footprints of elephants, and it preserved some fossilized raindrops as well. So Andrew Hill and Kay Berensmeyer stopped the game of elephant dung dodgeball, called everyone over, and began again this great discovery in our science. Over the course of several weeks, the team, led by again Mary Leakey, cleared the area, and they were able to expose about 17,000 footprints of all sorts of different animals that walked across this volcanic ash 3.5 million years ago, 3.6 million years ago. Mary asked the team to be on the lookout for something moving on two legs, a biped, a hominin. And in September of that year, they discovered 5 consecutive footprints of something that was indeed moving on 2 legs. And those are sort of the red circles that are shown on this slide, 4 of the prints, the second one, the best preserved. She was really excited about this. She made some replicas of these footprints. She brought them around to Washington, D.C., and to folks in England, to London, to Michael Day. And they weren't convinced that these were hominin footprints. And she was no longer convinced after a couple of years. She, in 1978, her team was part of the discovery of the very famous G Trail. This is a different site at Laetoli, about 2.5 kilometers away from the very first site. And these are undoubtedly hominin footprints, a foot that looks very similar to yours and mine, the big toe in line with the other digits, a prominent heel strike, and at least 3 individuals walking in parallel, 2 individuals walking in parallel and 1 walking in the footprints of the other. So 3.6 million years ago, good bipeds walking, again, not exactly like us, but a lot like us. The details of these footprints, I'm not going to go into too much, but there's some really, I see these as a great intersection of art and science, that we can collect data from these and we can test hypotheses with these footprints about how they were walking. But then there's a lot of artistic renditions of what was happening here. The footprints, for instance, are so close together that in order to squeeze 2 individuals next to each other, the best way to do it is to have them with their arms around each other, like you see in this image here from the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And in the 1970s, this discovery, combined with the announcement of Australopithecus afarensis, Lucy's species, fit this narrative of linear human evolution, of 1 hominin or at most 2 hominins living at the same time, and a chimp-like ancestor evolving via Australopithecus and early Homo, eventually into Homo sapiens. Okay, here's the problem though. The problem are those pesky footprints from Site A, the very first site that was discovered, something walking on 2 legs. But the feet were weird and the gait is kind of weird. They were very different from the foot and the gait of the G footprints, which were attributed to Lucy and her kind, Australopithecus afarensis. So there's this real mystery of what in the world made these things. And a researcher at the University of Chicago, Russ Tuttle, proposed that perhaps this is a different species of hominin, or perhaps this is not a hominin at all. Maybe these footprints were made by another bipedal mammal, and one of the more bipedal mammals is a bear. And this ursid hypothesis, this idea that bears made these footprints, really took hold, even though Tuttle had a number of different explanations for them, including a second hominin. Most of the scientific community thought these feet were different enough from hominins to say, well, they're probably ursid then. So fast forward now about 30 years, and where I teach at Dartmouth College in northern New England, we have a lot of bears up here, a lot of black bears. And I had a graduate student, Ellie McNutt, who was quite interested in bears. They climb a lot, they move on 2 legs a lot, they don't have tails, sort of like, apes don't have tails either. They're actually an interesting model for a large, occasionally orthograde, occasionally climbing mammal to test some hypotheses about functional anatomy, and in this case, about footprints. So we teamed up with Ben Killam. Ben Killam is one of the world's experts in the American black bear, and we asked the question of how often are bears bipedal? How often do they take 4 or 5 consecutive bipedal steps, which is what would be necessary to match locomotion in a modern bear to what we find at the site of Laetoli. And it turns out it's exceptionally rare. We looked at hundreds of hours of footage of bears moving. They're only bipedal about 1% of the time. When they are bipedal, it's almost always postural, moving from point A to point B. They usually do not stride on two legs. And when they do, it's almost always less than 4 steps. So it's a very unusual circumstance to have 4 or 5 consecutive steps of like what we find at Laetoli, especially in the absence of any quadrupedal footprints from an ursid. We wanted to collect footprints as well. And so we worked with rehabilitated bears, or bears that were being rehabilitated. These are some of the cubs at Ben Killam's facility that were being nursed back to health and eventually released back into the wild. They have feet that are about the same size as the footprints at Laetoli. And so we enticed them to walk through a muddy substrate by holding up maple syrup or bowls of applesauce, which they loved, and they would walk on their 2 legs for us and leave footprints. And so we then used 3D laser scanners to quantify some of the foot morphology and functional morphology. Okay, so a little bit of data now. What we find is that, not surprisingly, bears take wide steps. They don't have the same kind of musculature around their hips that we do. And so they wobble from side to side when they walk on 2 legs. That's what's graphed here on the y-axis, is this ratio between stride width and step length. How wide are their strides? And they're quite wide. And that's quite similar to what we see in chimpanzees, who lack the abductor mechanism that humans have at the hip joint that allows them to stride on 1 leg at a time in a balanced way. Humans, however, and all of the footprints at Laetoli, the ones at site G, the ones at site S, which I haven't mentioned, and then even the ones at site A, are very narrow footprints, which would suggest they belong to something that did have the arrangement of the hip musculature in a way that they could balance on a single leg at a time while they're walking on 2 legs. Now, this is all well and good, but we really felt like we needed to see the original footprints in order to test our idea that maybe they weren't bear, maybe they were hominin. So in 2019, our team went off to Laetoli. We joined Charles Musiba at the University of Colorado, Denver. Our fear was that they had been washed away, that 40 years of seasonal rains, erosion gives you footprints and then it takes them from you. And we just assumed that the erosive power of those East African rainstorms would have just washed these prints away. They had certainly washed the road away. So as we were trying to get to the site, we had to rebuild the road. This is a common feature of any of you who are listening who do work in remote sites. You often have to rebuild roads. It's one of the most beautiful places that I've ever worked. We were greeted by a tower of giraffes. Now, where do we start looking? Mary Leakey, I've gained so much respect for her as a scientist as I've taken a deep dive into this project. Her notes were amazing, and she kept detailed maps of the footprint sites at Laetoli, which were published in her 1987 book. I wasn't sure how accurate these maps were, and I now know that they are stunningly accurate. So even though this was a bit of a needle in a haystack situation, we at least had a map to go on. We went to site A, the first one discovered. We found that yes, in fact, large portions of it had washed away. There's a whole region here that had been washed away to the west, and then we measured out to exactly where the hominin footprint should be, hoping they were there. They weren't. There was a lot of sediment in the area, and so we started digging. And we dug and we dug and we dug for a couple of days. I assumed that we weren't going to find anything. We really started giving up hope. And then one of our field assistants, Callisti Fabian, discovered on day 3 one of the footprints. And in fact, it was the best preserved of them, which is the 3rd footprint. And we were so excited. And we cleared the area. We used tongue depressors and thick bristled brushes as our digging devices, and we were able to find those 5 footprints. We extended the dig south and north, but erosion had taken away that area as well. So this is just sort of the snapshot of those 5 footprints. When we compare our excavation to the original excavation in the 1970s, there was a lot of sediment still in that footprint in the 1970s. They didn't fully excavate that print, which is why I think some of the interpretations that were made were made. With a complete excavation of the print, you can see not only the big toe, but you can see the second digit as well, the dimple of the second digit, which you couldn't have seen in the 1970s. The other thing that you couldn't do in the 1970s is get high resolution topographic data from these footprints. And we were able to do that with a portable 3D laser scanner. And then do some simple comparisons of, does a bear footprint actually match anatomically what we see here with the hominin? And the answer is no. Bears have much narrower heels. They have a fan-shaped toe box. They don't have an enlarged big toe the way primates, apes, and hominins do. So that's one of the things that we quantified. We looked at the size of the big toe next to the size of the adjacent digit. And as you all know, primates have large hallexes. They have large big toes. That includes all the apes and includes humans. And so does the Laetoli footprint from Site A. Bears, however, their digits, whether it's digits 1 and 2 or 4 and 5, we checked both, are very similar to each other in size. Now, a lot of people stop me and say, wait a minute, bears in Africa, what are you talking about? That should have been a non-starter. We do have fossil bears in Africa. In South Africa, Ethiopia, Kenya, there have been fossils of Agriotherium, which is an enormous bear, about the size of a polar bear, that lived in Africa in the Pliocene. But I think important to our story here and to our argument, there are no fossils of this species at Laetoli. So we don't have any footprints of a quadrupedal bear, thousands of footprints, but no quadrupedal bear, and no fossils either. So I think the argument that these footprints were made by bears, it starts to crumble when you combine all the evidence together. And if it's not a bear, then what is it? Well, it's a bipedal primate, also known as a hominin. And we have a hominin from this site. It's Australopithecus afarensis. It's Lucy and her kind. And that species left us footprints at Laetoli. So we can compare those footprints. And we just assumed that we had found more afarensis footprints. They're quite small, so I wondered maybe if they were juvenile. And as we started taking a deeper dive into this and analyzing these footprints a little more closely, what we found is that their anatomy, or the footprint itself, it presents very differently from the footprint at Site G and the footprints at Site S, which look a lot more like yours and mine. The footprint at Site A, the not bear footprints that we think are hominin, well, are they Australopithecus? Well, if they are, they'd be an Australopithecus that has a very wide foot, more like a chimpanzee's. And if we looked at this image again, the big toe is sticking out to the side a little bit more than what you see in the G prints. Not quite like what you see in a chimpanzee, but still a little bit more. Now we know what the foot of Australopithecus afarensis looked like, both from footprints and from their bones. So what then is this thing? Could this thing fit into the range of variation of footprints that are made by Australopithecus afarensis? Of course, there's gonna be variation in their feet. Not everyone has the same shaped feet. Not everyone makes the same footprints. Same sort of thing could be argued for Australopithecus. And so Kevin Hatala at Chatham University helped us with this analysis, looking at the likelihood that this is just sampling normal variation. And what he found was that these feet are as different from each other as a chimpanzee's foot is from a typical human's foot. And so we think that's convincing evidence that these are not the same thing, that these are different species making different footprints because they walk in different ways. This idea of different hominins coexisting on a landscape, walking in different ways, is also supported by the fossil evidence. In 2012, Johannes Haile Selassie published a fascinatingly bizarre foot from Ethiopia that was a contemporary of Lucy and her kind of Afarensis, known as the Bertelli foot. It has not been given a species designation. However, he has found fossils in the vicinity of what he has called a separate species, Australopithecus diarymeta. So there could be two different kinds of Australopithecus, again, walking in different ways on different feet at this time. And this is something we're beginning to see throughout human evolution. So this is an image from a Scientific American piece that just published. What we're doing is working from top to bottom, 7 million years ago at the top, current day at the bottom. And at any point throughout human evolution, we've known for some time now that there were different hominins coexisting. But I think this idea that they were actually walking in different ways, it has not been part of our narrative. And I think that's exactly what's going on, is that you have diversity in bipedal biomechanics happening at this throughout human evolution, including at Lucy's time, as evidenced by the Bertelli foot and the Laetoli footprints, but then all the way up until the middle Pleistocene and late Pleistocene with things like Homo naledi and Homo floresiensis. And so what we're beginning to learn from our fossils and from our footprints now is that human evolution was more complex and frankly more interesting than I think any of us could have imagined and envisioned, with hominins in different ecosystems walking in different ways on slightly different shaped feet. So thank you all very much, and I look forward to your questions. I will stop sharing.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to either use the raise hand function, and then I'll call on you and you can unmute, or send it in the chat if you're having any problems with your microphone or just don't want to ask out loud, and I can read that out. But I guess I'll start out with a few questions. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if there's any evidence of bones healing in any other animals without like human care, like chimpanzees, for example, or anything like that?
Yeah, there are. There's been some great work starting with Adolf Schultz on this question. He pointed out, for instance, a whole lot of healed fractures in gibbons, siamongs. Yes, absolutely, in chimpanzees. Nancy Lovell's done some really nice work on this. I think the important thing, and this was something I kind of went down the rabbit hole a couple of years ago looking into, is do we see a decrease in the frequency of healed fractures amongst animals that are committed to bipedal locomotion? And so ostriches, for instance, emus, these large rat-type birds, and it turns out that healed fractures in skeletal collections of terrestrial flightless birds is almost unheard of. It's exceptionally rare, even amongst saltatory rodents. So rodents that hop versus rodents that move on all fours, healed fractures amongst that population, again, very, very low. And so the presence of healed fractures in chimpanzees and gorillas and other primates, I think is interesting and important, but I think a better comparison might be looking at the frequency of healed fractures in something that is restricted to locomotion on just two limbs, like we are. So that's where sort of the ostriches and the rodents come in. What intrigues me, and I'm still trying to figure out how to explain, and maybe there's not a good way, are all those healed fractions in gibbon arms. Yeah. So gibbons seem to be able to still do fine. And heal okay, even if they fracture an arm, which seems to me like that should be the end game of that gibbon if it breaks its arm, but they seem to be okay. So what is it that allows them to survive? Are they exhibiting any conspecific care behavior, prosociality behavior with their partners? Because they tend to pair bond. I'm not sure. So it's a great question.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And you answered my follow-up question, which was going to be whether the broken limbs seen in gibbons were in the arms or the legs. but for the other ones,
both. You see them in both.
Yeah.
It is more frequent in the legs. We were looking at collections at Harvard. They've got a ton of stuff at Harvard, and it is much more frequent in the legs. Mm-hmm. But we still found a few fractures in the arms that we thought, oh, how did this gibbon not die? Like this is amazing. The sort of, you know, like the dislocations and fractures that you know, you'd think that the animal, there's no way the animal would have been able to continue to locomote the way it obviously. Well, it stayed alive, right? So it was able to move in a way to get its food, at least for a little while.
Yeah, and that's quite interesting that a lot of other animals might just be healing because they have 3 other limbs and can put the weight on those. So until their other one heals, but yeah, bipedal ones obviously can't do that. And yeah, there are a few questions in the chat. So the first one is by Theo. And they're asking, do we have any Paranthropus feet in the fossil record?
It's a great question. Yes and no. Sorry to be so vague in my answer. What we don't have is a Lucy for Paranthropus. We don't have a really good skeleton of Paranthropus to know what their feet looked like. And therefore, when we find isolated foot bones, can we say with 100% certainty that we're attributing them correctly to Paranthropus versus Homo, because they lived at the same time, right? So when you find an isolated talus that's 2 million years old, and you have in that same deposit, say it's Swartkrons or it's Cubiphora, so many of these sites, Olduvai Gorge, right? So many of these sites have both Paranthropus and Homo, and it becomes this sort of guessing game. And we do our best. We try to connect the dots between things we think are Paranthropus, and then that becomes the Rosetta Stone for these other things we're not sure. And so we think we're getting it right with feet from Paranthropus, but we really don't know. That's on my sort of, you know, wish list. You know, every year when I think about, oh, what would I love to see come out of the fossil record this year? A partial skeleton of Paranthropus with some foot bones sure would be nice. Now, the type specimen from Cromdry of Paranthropus robustus does have a talus. And here's how this gets messed up is, and there are some first metatarsals from Swartkrons as well that have been attributed to Paranthropus. If they are, they look a lot to me like the OH8 foot at Olduvai Gorge, which everyone calls Homo habilis, because Louis Leakey said it was Homo habilis, so okay, it's Homo habilis, and it's quite human-like. But the first metatarsal and the talus to me look like the things we've been calling Paranthropus. So I've wondered, and I've put this in writing too, that maybe that foot belongs to Paranthropus and not to a Homo habilis. So do we have a Paranthropus foot? Maybe, if OH8 is Paranthropus. But I would say the majority of the scientific community thinks I'm wrong on that. So, and I might be. So we'll see as we find more fossils.
Yeah, thank you for that. And we have another question from Xingyan. I'm not entirely sure I understand it, but I think they're asking what is the biggest significance of the study of humans' first steps in our daily lives?
So what I would argue is that all of these things that we celebrate about being human, you know, we talk about being able to talk. We have our large brains, and so we're creative. And why are we creative? Well, our hands are not being used for locomotion. They've been liberated from the duties of locomotion. That all of these things that we talk about and really celebrate about being human can trace their origins back to upright walking. And so, you know, as researchers, we're always thinking about you know, what makes us us? What makes us different? Are we so different? And primatologists, you know, will study chimpanzees and gorillas and orangutans and say, no, maybe we're not. Maybe we're very similar to our primate cousins in all these ways. And this effort that we have as scientists to try to figure out, you know, this grand human experiment, what I've come to realize is that none of it would have happened without this new form of locomotion that we experimented with for the first time 6-7 million years ago, this bipedalism, that it was the foundational piece for all these other things that came later. And that's why I'm so fascinated by it. That's why I'm so interested in it. Is that, to me, it is the stage setter. It is the thing that had to happen first for anything else. Large brains, language, diversification of diet, migration, into Eurasia, eventually around the planet, our ability to construct stone tools, to eventually make symbolic objects. All those things can trace their origins back to being able to move on two legs. And so that's why I think it's so important, and why I'm at least fascinated by it.
And then we have a question from Alina, and they're asking, do we know the chronology of development of bipedalism versus losing our fur?
So there's this really fascinating study that was done by researchers at the University of Florida. This was in the early 2000s, if I'm not mistaken. Because look, when you're finding fossils or stone tools, there are certain things you can't learn from those things. And one of them is how furry we were, right? When did our body hair thin? And it turns out that we actually have the same number of hair follicles as chimpanzees do. It's just that the individual hairs are much thinner and shorter. But when did that happen? And how could we ever know that? And paleontologists would say, well, we never could, right? And we'd have to infer that from behavior, that they're now moving in a grassland environment during, during the heat of the day, and they need to be able to sweat and blah, blah, blah. And you hear that all the time about Homo erectus. But you'd love to have more concrete evidence. So, okay, University of Florida folks, they looked at the genetics of lice, and they looked at these 3 different species of lice that cohabitate with humans. So there's the head louse, there's the body louse, or pubic louse, and then there's a clothing louse. And the question was, when did those species diverge from each other? And what they found was that the clothing louse was quite recent, and that kind of makes sense, with clothing probably being a recent human invention. And by recent, I forget the exact numbers, but it's something like 500,000 years ago. And then the divergence of the head louse from the pubic louse was complicated, but in essence, it was about 3 million years ago, around Lucy's time. And so to me, that makes a lot of sense, that Australopithecus would have begun to be active during the daytime when the big cats are asleep. So the animals that are going to be our predators are in the shade, they're asleep, and our ancestors are now, when can you safely get food for yourself? I think it's around that time when the big cats are asleep, but not if you're furry. And if you're furry, you're not going to be able to dissipate body heat as effectively. And so if you're really active during the daytime, as I think Australopithecus probably was, you can't be a picky eater. And so you got to eat anything you can. And that's how I interpret some of the dietary evidence that's coming out from isotopes and tooth wear studies, is it looks like they're eating everything that they can get their hands on. And so that kind of makes sense to me. And then the reduction of the body hair at that time, around 3 million years ago, also makes sense if it coincides with the development of sweat glands. We haven't figured that one out yet, but I think it's just a matter of time before some clever scientist, who's much more clever than I am, comes up with a way to figure out when sweat glands evolved, or at least increased in concentration. In my guess, it's going to be in the ballpark of 2 to 3 million years ago. So it looks like bipedalism precedes the loss of body hair by several million years, but I do think that they're coincident in the establishment of a good biped in a grassland environment. And that's how I see most Australopithecus.
Yeah, thank you for that. And then just one final question, and you've already kind of answered it somewhat or hinted at it, but I was just wondering if humans are the only known animals to sweat, or if there are other known ones that sweat?
I mean, horses do. So there are other animals that produce that can dissipate body heat by having a layer of water on the surface of their bodies. And yeah, horses will do that. And so we're not the only ones. But if you're looking at apes and you're looking at primates, we are pretty unusual in how we dissipate our body heat. I mean, most mammals pant. That when they get overheated, they sit in the shade and release their heat through the mechanism of panting. And so, yeah, I mean, I would. That's another one of those sort of top 10 discoveries I'd love to see is what can we time the origin of this expansion of sweat glands, because I really think that allows us to move into ecosystems that were previously unavailable to us, either spatially or temporally. And I mean, given what we've learned about Homo erectus, for instance, and where we find hand axes and where we see that they're living and the kinds of things they're doing, they had to have had sweat glands. I'd be shocked if it postdates something like that. So then the question is, okay, we know Homo erectus goes back at least 2 million years. So do sweat glands go back farther than that? And that time period, that 2 to 4 million years, I love that time period. It's such an interesting time period to me of, how were these ancestors of ours, that hadn't invented fire yet. The technology was still pretty crude. How in the world did they survive and make it through what seemed to be sort of this really difficult gauntlet to get to something like Homo erectus? I look at Homo erectus and I'm like, yeah, of course that thing could survive. Like that's an awesome hominin in that landscape, technologically savvy, big brain, compared to its predecessors. It's sort of this, this Australopithecus world that excites me the most, because their survival in that landscape still, to me, seems like it would have been incredibly challenging, and that they would have had to have overcome a lot. And how they did it fascinates me.
Yeah, and I think you said in First Steps, right, that if you had a time machine, you'd go back to the time of Lucy, right?
I would. Yeah, I'd hang out with Lucy for a day.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for the lecture, and thank you everyone for coming. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture and our seminar series. And this is actually our last seminar for the term, as well as the last one, which will be hosted by myself and the current committee, as we'll be having a new one take over after the break. So yeah, thank you very much. And
thank you.
See you.
Thanks, everyone.